All right, for chapter 40, we're going to be discussing amphibians, creatures which you're familiar with, like frogs, toads, salamanders. We're going to go through all of their characteristics today, talk about some different groups within amphibians, and talk about how they have evolved over time. So all amphibians are found in the class Amphibia. That makes sense. Sounds a lot like amphibian. Remember back to your levels of classification. We're in the domain Eukarya, so everything in that domain has a cell that has a nucleus inside of it. We're in the phylum Chordata at this point because we're going to be talking about living things that are vertebrates. They have a backbone and they have an internal skeleton. And we are now in the class Amphibia, which includes all of your amphibians. So amphibia means double life, and that is used to describe that the amphibians spend some of their life entirely in water and some of their life on land. So double life, that's what that means for amphibia. We'll be talking about pre-adaptations in amphibians and amphibian ancestors. These are adaptations in an ancestral group that allow a shift to new functions, which are later favored by natural selection. So we'll talk about a couple things where it looks like there were some adaptations in ancestors to amphibians that allowed amphibians to move on land and live better on land over time. So when we look at amphibian evolution, we talked last chapter about the lobed fin fishes like the coelacanth. Uh, Scientists look at their genetics, they look at their body structures, and they believe that those lobed fin fishes are the ancestors to today's amphibians. That's because when we look at their fins, they have like a single bone structure with actually a little bit of movement capable, almost like muscles and bones in very small legs. So when we look at how those lobed fin fishes evolved over time, we find some ancestors to amphibians that are now extinct, but we do have their fossils, and we can find that there looks to be a transition between those lobed fin fishes and then fish that can kind of walk on land a little bit, like very, very little. But as time went on, those fish that could move a little bit better on land, they were able to survive more. And then those working legs got passed down more and more so that those legs got better and better. Remember, why would it be an advantage for some of those lobed fin fishes to get the ability to live on land? Well, a long time ago, there might not have been that many things living on land. There might have been, some good food sources for those fish that were able to live out of water for a little bit. There might not have been as many predators. The ocean was getting pretty crowded. So it might have been an advantage to get the ability to live on land. I know that's really hard to think about because not only are we talking about, fish species eventually evolving legs, but we're also talking about them evolving lungs. So a lot goes into the idea of those fish, those early amphibian ancestors evolving and getting adapted to land. But remember, we're talking about millions and millions of years here. So little changes can add up over those millions and millions of years. If given enough time, something like that certainly is possible. However, remember, we were not there to see this, so we're basing this off of the evidence that we have. And right now, based off of genetics, based off of the fossils, this is the best explanation that we have at the current time. Great thing about science is that the more we discover, the better we get at coming up with theories and coming up with better theories. So that's something that might change over time. Those forelimbs of those amphibians that we're going to be talking about, they're homologous. That means that they show evolutionary relationships to the pectoral fins of fishes. So what that means is basically the front limbs of amphibians like a frog or a salamander. It shows that when you look at their structure and you look at the structure of the pectoral fins of some of our fish species, they're related to each other. They show that those structures are related to each other. So the front fins on a fish, they are evolutionary related to the front limbs of an amphibian. So when we look at modern amphibians that are here today, most of them go through metamorphosis. This is a huge structural change throughout the organism's life. A big example that we have is our frog. It starts out looking sort of like a fish, looks completely different than the adult frog. And then it goes through changes over time. It starts to lose that tail that it used for swimming in water. It starts to lose the gills that it had early on, and it starts to develop lungs. It starts to sprout legs and gets more adapted for living on land. That's different than like what humans do. When we start out as humans, we still look like a human. We still have legs and eyes and a nose and everything. It's just that we get bigger and we develop and we age over time. We don't go through metamorphosis. We don't start out looking like something completely different and then change into a human. We go through development. So metamorphosis is a little bit different. Most of your amphibians, they're going to have moist, thin skin with no scales. So if we take a look at our pictures over here, A, of course, is a snake. That's a reptile. You can easily see the scales on it. Frogs, toads, salamanders, other amphibians, for picture B, this one, you cannot see scales on it. Their skin's going to be much more smooth. It's going to tend to be more slimy because they actually need their skin to remain slimy because they kind of breathe through their skin. They get a lot of oxygen through their skin and transport it to their lungs. So no, they're not just dependent upon their nostrils for breathing, but they also depend on their skin. Their skin is also very sensitive. So pollution in the air and the water can really harm our amphibians. They're really sensitive to those changes. The feet of amphibians will often lack claws. So here we have a picture of a frog's foot. We can see that it has like little toe pads on it to stick to things. Oftentimes they're webbed because even though they live on land and breathe air when they're adults, they do oftentimes spend time in water, getting food or just staying damp so that they don't dehydrate. So they do spend a lot of time swimming. They also reproduce in water. So that's going to be something that is really important for them to have, that webbed feet so they can swim. Most will be using gills, lungs, and skin for respiration. So when they're younger, they'll be dependent mostly upon their gills. When they're older adults, they'll be depending more on their lungs and their skin for respiration. Okay, here's a picture of a salamander over here. You can see that this one kind of keeps a tail that is designed more for swimming. Looks like this one's maybe spending time by like a creek or by like a river. It's up out of the water a little bit. But those are some characteristics that we'll see in those salamanders. The eggs of our amphibians are also going to be different than the eggs of, like, say, a reptile or a bird. The eggs of amphibians, they lack shells. They're like this picture over to the left. You can see the little amphibian. Looks like it's going to be a salamander inside of that egg. Mostly is a jelly-like egg. It contains a membrane, but no shell around it. One of the reasons that it doesn't have a shell is because these eggs are going to be in water, so it's not going to be super likely that they get crushed. They don't need a whole bunch of protection from the air on the outside because they're already in water, so that water kind of helps support them. We don't see amphibians having eggs that have shells in it, unlike the lizard that we see being hatched over to the right, and like the eggs. So that's a big difference in the eggs of the amphibians compared to other things that lay eggs. All right, so now we'll go through some of the orders of our amphibians and talk about what organisms are there and what characteristics they have. So our first order we have is Anura, and this means tailless. So these are going to be amphibians that at the end of their metamorphosis lack a tail. So of course this includes your frogs and your toads, like you see in our pictures over here. That toad down at the bottom looks like he's getting some serious air there. It looks like he's running a relay race or something. It's pretty funny. Um, these are going to be found worldwide except in polar climates and a few isolated oceanic islands. So we find frogs and toads almost everywhere on Earth except for where it's super, super, super cold and in some islands where they haven't been able to travel to. They have a body that's adapted for jumping. All right, they jump to catch their prey. They jump to avoid being prey. It's a good mode of transport. So they have these very, very muscular legs for their body that they use to jump and to propel themselves. So frogs in general have smooth, moist skin. You can see some pictures of a couple adult frogs here, as well as a tadpole up towards the top. Some forms have a very sticky tongue that can be extended to catch prey. We see that a lot in tropical types of frogs. They spend time in tree frogs. They spend time up in the tree, and they catch insects with their very, very sticky tongues. Here's an example of that down towards the left of a frog using that. So some of those frogs have those very sticky tongues. In nearly all species, the eggs are going to be fertilized externally. That means outside of the body, and they'll be turned into tadpoles. So usually the female frog will lay the eggs, and the male frog will come around and deposit sperm in the water or deposit sperm on the eggs, and that's how fertilization will occur. So in the picture in the middle, the white picture with the frog laying all the eggs there, you can see that frogs lay many eggs. If we ever dissect a frog, maybe try to find a video of that for you. A lot of the frogs have just hundreds and hundreds of eggs on the inside if it's a female frog. And you got to move them out of the way to kind of see some of the body parts. So that's going to be a lot of your frog characteristics. It's a picture of a lungless frog. So there are a few species of frogs that maybe keep their gills throughout their adult life, and they need to stay in the water to breathe through their skin, breathe through their gills. So that's going to be an exception to some of the other adult frogs that we've been talking about. The big difference between toads and frogs is that toads have very rough, bumpy skin. So we see a lot of toads around in our area. I remember when I was little, I used to call toads frogs. They are very closely related, but there is a difference between them. Toads, they can deal a little bit more with being out of water. Their skin's a little bit tougher, so they can keep water for longer periods of time. In our picture over to the left, we see a giant cane toad, and a guy holding it up there. So toads can get pretty big. Looks like that one might be maybe over a foot in size. They're a pretty big toad. So not all of them are like small, like the ones we have in our area. Our next order of amphibians is order Caudata. This refers to their caudal tail. This means they have a tail. So our big group of organisms in this order are these salamanders. They have elongated, stretched out bodies, long tails, and moist skin. We have a couple pictures here. The black and yellow one there, that's an example of a Japanese salamander. There are lots of salamanders in the world, lots of different species. Pennsylvania does contain I think maybe a little bit less than a dozen species or so. I gotta double check that, but we do have quite a few species of salamanders in our area. Some of you might have seen them. They tend to hang out in very moist areas around ponds and creeks, so they're pretty cool. But they're in the order Caudata. That's going to be their order that they belong in. Another order of our amphibians is called Gymnophiona, and this contains an amphibian that you might not have heard about, but there are a few species of them, and they're pretty cool looking. They're called Caecilians. They're a highly specialized group of legless amphibians that resemble small snakes. So I know this looks an awful lot like a snake. It doesn't have any legs, has that same slender body, but if you look, its body's very, very slimy. If you know anything about snakes, their bodies are not slimy at all. They're very, very dry, rough. They're covered with scales. So think of snakes as sort of like legless lizards. The Sicilian here, think of this as like a legless salamander, but a very, very long one. Almost looks like an earthworm, right? So this is one that I'm guessing that some of us haven't heard of before, but they do exist on Earth, and they're pretty interesting. Um, so that's going to be one of the other orders of amphibians that we have. So the amphibian systems that we're going to discuss, we're going to talk about some of the organ systems that they have and how it helps them. The skin serves two important functions. It serves for respiration and protection. The thin, moist skin allows gas exchange to happen through those cells. So that's going to be really important. It also allows the frog to have protection from the environment, so that if something, if it runs into something, it has kind of tough skin, not as tough as a reptile, but it still gives them some protection. There's an example of a frog called a survivor frog. This type of frog, it can actually freeze in the winter. It can freeze and go into something called suspended animation. That means that it's still living, but it's frozen solid. It has a way to actually keep its blood pumping by using almost like an antifreeze in its blood. Its cells produce almost like an antifreeze. So it can just basically freeze on the outside, but on the inside, its blood keeps flowing and it keeps it alive. Then in these places like in Canada where this happens, when summertime comes and it gets warmer and the snow melts, the frog can actually thaw out and then come back to motion. I don't want to say come back to life because it was still living, but it was frozen solid like a rock. So that's a really cool example that we see here in our picture of the survivor frog that can actually go through that huge process. So the amphibian heart has three chambers and pumps both deoxygenated and oxygenated blood. So there are some similarities here, just like we have veins that carry uh, deoxygenated blood back to our heart, and we have arteries that pump the oxygenated blood away from our heart. Frogs do the same thing. However, the frog heart and the amphibian heart in general has three chambers. So the human heart actually has four. This allows our heart to pump a little bit more efficiently. Also, our heart's going to be obviously bigger. So the frog heart works really, really well for their size, and it works very efficiently. However, if they were going to be bigger, if the frogs were going to be like our size, that's kind of scary to think about. But if they were our size, they would likely have to have a much bigger heart, and obviously they would have to have more chambers in their heart to pump it around more efficiently. So when we talk about an amphibian's ability to breathe through its skin, the fancy name for that is called cutaneous respiration. Cutaneous means skin, so this respiration through the skin. All adult amphibians are going to be carnivorous. That means that they're going to be eating other living things, usually insects, maybe some other small, you know, lizards, some other small frogs, some very small fish, but they're going to be eating others. But when they're larvae, they're going to be herbivores, so they'll be eating algae, some plant life. So there's a difference there. Also, the kidneys for the amphibians, they're going to be the primary excretory system. So the kidneys help filter out waste from their blood, form urine, so that they can go to the bathroom. So that's going to be very important. Here we have a picture of of skin of a frog in a little diagram showing you how oxygen moves in through the skin, and then the carbon dioxide moves out through the skin. So that's similar to how we breathe in and out, right? We breathe in oxygen, breathe out carbon dioxide. So big similarity there. Many amphibians also have something called an nictitating membrane. This is a thin, transparent membrane that's movable and covers the eyes. So in our picture down below here, we have a frog, and you can see its eye. It's being covered by this membrane. It's not actually completely shut. This is almost like a second eyelid that it has to help protect it while it's underwater. It's a very, very quick membrane that can cover the eye. So that helps protect their eyes underwater and also on land if something comes to bother their eyes, dust, or if it's being attacked by something. Sounds are going to be transmitted to the brain by something called a tympanic membrane. So in our picture over to the right, we see this frog with its eyes closed. We can see a little bit of that nictitating membrane where S is pointing. Where T is pointing, that is the tympanum. That's sort of like the eardrum of the frog. It's on the outside. It senses vibration. It senses sounds. Most of our amphibians are going to have that. Grasshoppers, we talked about uh, them having that tympanum as well, a little bit different, but still the same idea, almost like an eardrum for the amphibians. Frogs are going to reproduce in water or very wet places due to the following reasons. The eggs are going to be fertilized externally, that means outside of the body. So it's helpful for the eggs to be in water and for the sperm to be released in water because this helps the sperm swim and be carried to the eggs. So that's very, very helpful, a lot easier for that to happen. These eggs have a jelly-like coating that is permeable to water, so it allows water into the egg when the egg needs water. It allows the gases into the egg when the egg needs different gases like oxygen. If you remove these eggs from water, they're going to dry out, okay, and they're going to dehydrate, and then the little larva that's inside of the little tadpoles that we see in these pictures, they will die. So those are three reasons why amphibian reproduction is going to happen in water. So that's the really cool thing about amphibians. They start out in water, they move to land, a lot of them, and then when they reproduce, they move back to water to reproduce in the water. So that's going to be a big life cycle that all of our amphibians are going to share. So for the reproduction of amphibians, once again, metamorphosis is the big idea, the series of changes in the life cycle of an amphibian. And here we have a frog. So we have a picture of the frog going from eggs to a tadpole to something called a metamorph, where it's almost a frog, but it still has that little tail, spend a little bit of time in water, and then to the full adult frog. During metamorphosis, these are three things that happen. You'll be asked about these three things, so please pay attention to this. The lungs in the amphibians, they're going to replace the gills that are there early on. So the eggs, the tadpole, they're going to have gills. They're going to start to lose those gills as they become a metamorph, and the lungs are going to replace them so they can start to live on land. Also, limbs develop so we can see that the legs start to develop as the tadpole gets bigger and bigger and turns into a metamorph. Also, the tail will eventually disappear. So those are the big changes that happen in metamorphosis for most amphibians.